Thank you all for being here. This is my first time as a moderator, so if anybody wants to moderate me, just let me know. So basically, I'm going to introduce everybody here, and then we're just going to get into it and see if we can generate some lively discussion. So Lee Cole, to my left, is the author of Fulfillment, which came out in June of 2025, and Groundskeeping from 2022, which was a Today Show Read with Jenna book club pick. He was born and grew up in rural Western Kentucky, a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He now lives in Philadelphia. Patrick Ryan is the author of Buckeye, which came out just recently. It's already pretty much a bestseller across the board. Congrats. I'm just going to keep this kind of short, the intros, because these people are all famous. So, Adam Ross, author of Playworld, came out in January of 2025, and he's also the author of Mr. Peanut from, I think, 2010. Yes. Also is the editor of the Sewanee Review. And then finally, Chad Holley is a native of Mississippi. He earned his MFA in creative writing from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And his first novel, and he's also been published in Shenandoah, Greensboro Review, Story South, and Shielded Joyous is his first novel, and it was also, along with my book, Holy City, which is pretty exciting, a finalist for the Willie Morris Award. So please give them a round of applause. So now I'll try to make myself stop talking, and we're going to get into this topic of family fiction. So I'm curious, to what extent does the idea of family guide your work? Was it a conscious thing, or did it just sort of evolve out of writing that you were already doing?
Well, for me, I think the family presents an opportunity for microcosm. So you can kind of look at an individual family and use the drama that's going on in the household or in the family to kind of illustrate broader social problems and stuff that's going on countrywide or larger things. So I can't say that I ever set out. I don't ever sit down and think, okay, now I'm going to write a family story, or now I'm working on a family novel. It's just kind of, I'm working on a project and families happen to exist in it,
I don't have much of a desire to write about my own family, although I have in the past, but not anymore. But I sort of find like my family was incredibly, in many different ways, incredibly unhappy and broken up and messed up. And as a writer, it was kind of a big gift because it's such a landscape of mess. And nobody ever really figured it out. And then also, I'm about the only one left on my side of the family, so it's all mine to do what I want. But I find that I don't write about my own family, but then when I write about a family, I'm going mentally to that playground of catastrophe to draw from. So I feel like I always am, but I'm not drawing from my own anymore.
So my novel Playworld is about a child actor in 1980, and it takes place over the course of a year. He is a very successful child actor, and he's on a show called The Nuclear Family, which is about a group of superheroes who have been irradiated by a nuclear power plant disaster, and they activate their powers by saying "split up." So I mean, the idea of family in my novel and the atomization of family is pretty central. I was trying to write about. Family is where we get roles assigned to us, whether we like those roles or not. And I was very much trying to write about a family, a creative family, a family in the creative class, living in New York at a time when that was still possible. A normal middle-class life was possible for a family of artists, which it is not anymore. And so to kind of echo what Lee was saying, you know, the social, economic forces and then interpersonal ones and the stresses that they exert on each member of the family are, to me, central for, you know, just generating plot. And yeah, like Patrick, while people in my family are surviving, my dad's memory isn't what it used to be, and so if he gets mad about something that he reads, he forgets it the next day.
Oh, what a gift. I guess I wasn't conscious, to answer your question, Henry, about thinking of family or structuring my novel about family, at least in the ways that we normally, or that I normally think about family. But my novel is set in a rural neighborhood, very like the one I grew up in Yazoo City, just up the road. And we were talking earlier about there are different ways to think about family. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that I thought of this neighborhood as a kind of family, because it's all about these different boys and different children and different families that are all existing in this identifiably kind of small rural place. And I think they do interact like a family in a way. So when I look back on the book through the lens of family, that's actually the thing that steps out to me, is that it's structured like a family novel if you think of the family members as being different families living in houses on the same street or next door. So
Yeah, I find that interesting in so many of your books, just in this group. It does seem to be not just a family, it's like a world of families. So it is kind of one big family, and what you were saying, Lee, about it sort of being a microcosm of sort of what's going on in the country. You know, but yeah, author Nick Brown once said to me when I was sort of starting out to write fiction at Ole Miss, he said he always looks for a way to complicate a scene with dialogue, a scene with characters, by not just having two people in the mix, by, you know, including a third, if you can handle it, a fourth. I mean, three is a lot, but I'm curious, do you think that maybe writing about family is a way of doing that for you, either subconsciously or you know, something that you're actively trying to do, like I want to make this a more complex, realistic situation here?
Yeah, I think one thing that bugs me as a reader is when it's really obvious what the writer's stance is on an issue, and they don't give their villains or their ancillary characters kind of the best version of their arguments or something. And I think a family presents a good opportunity to do that, because, you know, most of my family are conservative evangelical Christians, and that's led to a lot of interesting conversations at family gatherings and, you know, Thanksgiving and Christmas and whatnot. In those heated moments, I'm maybe not willing to extend a lot of generosity, you know, or see what they're saying charitably. But when I'm sitting at the writing desk, I have to do that. Or I don't know exactly why I have to do that. I feel guilty if I don't do that for my characters. But yeah, I think it's that old kind of Shakespeare thing. Like, you have to give your villains like the best version of their argument, and really try to occupy their headspace and think about, like, well, how do they feel about this? Where are they coming from? And so yeah, I write about family. I guess I write about family arguments quite a bit. And when I'm in the middle of working on those scenes, I really try to think about, how can I complicate what might at first seem like a simple conflict? And that usually does involve a third person or a fourth person coming in and calling out someone's BS or deflating someone's pomposity or something like that.
I am a big Richard Yates fan, and I learned from Richard Yates, and I learned from reading the Easter Parade. Has anybody read the Easter Parade? Okay, so
Great.
this is great. You all get to read the Easter Parade. It's really, really depressing, and it's really, really funny, and it charts 40 years in the lives of two sisters, and it's very much about a family and their mother. It's a Richard Yates novel, so there's a mother who's artistically frustrated in the background. But what I learned from that book is that we often don't listen to each other when we're talking. And when we argue, we're often not having an exchange. We're just having a shout, remark. And when I read that book, I realized it's so dialogue heavy, and these people aren't listening to each other. They're very rarely responding to each other. And I thought that's what I grew up with. There were no conversations. There was just occasional talking, usually in a kind of unhappy, disgruntled kind of way. But I feel like dialogue and bringing in more than two characters and bringing in the third or the fifth or the sixth is a chance to really reflect the chaos that we call family life, daily life.
I mean, I'm my head's kind of exploding about this conversation because I haven't thought about it in these terms. But there are constant scenes in Playworld where the family is being moved into different locales, and how the various locales elicit different reactions depending on how many people are, for instance, in the scene, or how many people get subtracted from the scene, and when certain characters have freedom to be more themselves, depending who they're with, depending who's on stage, as it were, and who's off stage. I mean, it is always to me, I think, one of the richest, ripest milieus, to write about. But again, going back to what I was saying about performance, that is where each person, just the family at dinner, that's where each person monologues, and then which is followed, depending on their presence, by commentary. And if you're in control of your irony regarding the monologuing, the commentary becomes even more funny, And so I mean, it is always the richest thing dramatically, I think, to write about. But I don't think there's an author up here who wouldn't say that in the initial stages you're just feeling your way through scenes. Later you become really conscious of motifs, themes that are operating, and how you want to put dramatic pressure on those things. But it is the place, I think, where I find in those family settings, or at least looking back on the composition, where I felt like my characters were talking to me the most.
Yeah, I think I find one of the funnest things about introducing a third character to a scene where there's a lot of dialogue going on is just because somebody's not talking doesn't mean they're not participating in that scene. And I think, that there are any number of things, any number of ways they may be participating. But it's just like real life, and especially this is true with families, when you have to take an argument between two family members, if there's another family member present, what's going on in her mind? What's going on in his mind? Very often you want to try to mediate what's going on, and you don't know how. You're afraid you're going to make it worse, or you do try to mediate and you do make it worse, and now you're in the argument, or whatever. So one of the fun things for me is to just try to track what the non-speakers who are in that scene are doing. how are they responding to what's going on? And I think, that's one of the disciplines I think that writing fiction pushes on you is to, and one of you guys was mentioning this earlier, it forces you to do things like that. I mean, it is a way of processing experience and thinking about the world, and it forces you to not forget about that other character who's sitting there. These skills may or may not be transferable to real life. On my better days, they may be a little bit, but that's one of the fun things for me about introducing a third or even a fourth character.
Can I just say, I want to say one thing about dialogue, though. What is fun in a novel as you build your characters is then also in scenes where dialogue is predominant. The secret information that characters have about other characters and what they can and cannot say, and then the information that the reader has about characters that is injected into a scene. And so that I do think that when you feel like you're most in control of the juggling act. You are managing this silence and this verbosity.
Yeah, I used to have a very funny calendar that had something like one of the days was I never forgot this. It was family are those who know all your flaws and never let you forget them. and then I was also thinking, Kurt Vonnegut said, be a sadist, torture your characters. I wonder if family is a way to do that, and I don't mean that in like a cynical way, but is what makes family interesting the fact that people can't escape is, I mean.
Oh, but we can. We have. We're here.
I mean, we don't have to answer that.
Well, I think the interesting thing for me about what you're saying is just that you can't escape your family in the sense that you came from them. And so whatever your disagreements are with them, there's always going to be that lingering thing like, oh, but I came from these people. Like, what if I have in me what I, have so much trouble with in them, And in that way, I do think family is inescapable, and you have an obligation to them in some way. I don't know if obligation is the right word, but there's something similar, I think, to the contract that a writer has with their characters, maybe with the contract that a person has with their family, because your characters are coming from you too. I don't know.
That's really, I love what you just said. I have a little slightly meaner take on it in that I think, and I didn't realize this till you just said that, but I think that once I have developed the characters, I feel a greater sense of loyalty toward them. Not loyalty, that's not the right word maybe, but whatever word is sort of like loyalty, but doesn't mean something so, like the opposite of being backstabby. But you can create a character and then you can control how consistent they are. And you can decide when they're going to go off the rails. And that's one of the reasons why family is so hard. But I think what you said too is, Lee, it's really true that we all come from somewhere. And the writers personally that I know who have no interest in writing about their own, that just willfully eschew, I always feel like maybe that's, unless they're writing fantasy, unless they're totally stepping out, I feel like maybe that's a disservice to themselves, just not using the stuff. Sort of to come back to what we were talking about a little bit ago, is that I find when I read about anybody else's family, I'm still writing about mine because that's my starting point. But I think it's good to have come from somewhere, and it's good to not want to not have anything to do with however you were raised, because it's who we are. It's such a large part of our makeup.
Family is entirely inescapable. I mean, forget the fact that you spend, once you hit a certain age, you spend your entire life decoding your family of origin, right? And telling and retelling certain stories. But I mean, to at least for for these purposes, like riveting this to my book. I mean, there's a house fire. There's a house fire in Playworld, and the main character has a version of that story. And that story gets not only passed along from character to character, but gets deconstructed and retold. And, I mean, I do think that's one of the fascinating things about families is the way in which people not necessarily withhold information, or not intentionally, but can at some point tell you something that will completely reshuffle the deck in terms of what your understanding was about your identity. So family, you have a version. Everyone walks around with a version of their family. But if you're really like authentically humble and I mean, it doesn't sound like Lee's family at Christmas, but you're but if you're all talking to each other, someone deals out some information that not only makes you completely rethink foundational ideas of who you are, but does this thing that I think is really important and really, for me, always like deeply moving and humbling, which is like the degree to which you don't know the members of your family. I mean, I was joking with my father's a former actor, so anything you say about him, he loves because that makes him the star. But I mean, he has dementia, and I was thinking about. I was up in New York last week and spending some time with him, and I nearly got very emotional spending some time with him, just thinking about everything I don't know about him, even though I consider myself to know him really well. And if you can take that in a story, right? You can take that, again, that degree to which other people are a totality to which you cannot like wrap your head around. I think it opens up enormous like dramatic possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, and it's exhausting, right? Because you have to reimagine. I mean, you owe a kind of imaginative generosity to your family members, to the people in your life. I mean, you think you know who they are. You think you know what they mean to you and who that person is. I mean, like, who's going to know your family better than you do? But yeah, you don't. I mean, they're different human beings, and it's a lot of sort of moral, spiritual work to reimagine this person who is so seemingly familiar to you, and to realize, as you say, humbly, that they have a whole interior world going on and you don't know all that, what's going on with that person, and of course they don't know what all's going on with you either. But it just demands a kind of generosity that sometimes you want to just shut down and you're like, I know who you are. Forget. You always say this when I say that or whatever. But when you're on your game, hopefully you are extending them that kind of generosity to imagine them as a whole complicated, mysterious person who's changing. They're not fixed in time. You're not either. We're all developing.
I would also say, like, I think that since we're speaking about fiction, and if there are aspiring writers in the room, there's Tolstoy's famous happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are unhappy in their own unique way. I mean, like, I always like to add the descriptor, all invented families are unhappy in their unique way, because you have to take that kind of license and inject that kind of defamiliarization in order, I think, to write effectively and with greater generosity. My biggest, the most terrifying read I get of anything I write is my brother, because he and I were both. He's my once upon a timer, and so he has very strong opinions about what happened. And so if he reads something with interest, then I know I did a good job of inventing, because he can recognize the origin of the motivations, but he can also enjoy it because it's invented. And I think that's the pressure any writer feels, right, of fiction, where you're not as allied to the facts per se.
Yeah, that actually leads me to another question I've got, and I've got a lot. This is a 3-hour panel. But, craft-wise, how do you sit in the chair and try to make sure that, because, like, if I tell you about my family in conversation, you're probably going to walk away. It's like, my great-great-great-grandfather, when my dad would say that, I would just pretty much fall asleep.
Yeah.
And how do you make it exciting for the reader? How do you, like craft-wise, just thinking about what are you trying to do when you sit at your desk to try to make it something that the reader actually wants to go with?
I mean, I think it's always tension, right? It's always conflict, and for me, there's no shortage of that. I don't know. Misbehavior is what drives fiction for me, and there's plenty of that going on in the household and in families, and there are a lot of secrets in families, which is great fodder for fiction, especially if some characters know about the secret and some don't. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't approach writing about a family differently than I approach writing about any character. It's just, how can I make them do things that I wouldn't do in real life? How can I make them misbehave in an interesting way, and then explore the fallout of that misbehavior and how that affects other characters, and then also make that misbehavior plausible given the character's disposition.
It's all character plausibility and convincing, characters being convincing. It's what I worry about constantly. I don't really know what plot is, so I kind of notice that I kind of did it in the rearview mirror after a draft, and then I go back and sort of make the plot. But it's all about the characters and following the characters, and they have to feel convincing to me before I can think, well, then it's realistic that a reader might be convinced. And that's pretty much my big engine. It's just character.
It's just hard to overstate how, I mean, I hope everyone on this panel nods. It's hard to overstate how protean a novel in progress is. How protean, how malleable, so much of my novel I wrote out of order. But to this point, if we're looking at it strictly from a craft section, if I'm talking about something like autobiography, right? There's a scene in Playworld, a chapter in Playworld called Voiceover, where Griffin asks his father about the first time he fell in love, and his father tells this crazy story about his first love. I was trying to replicate what it was like. My father and I grew up in New York City, and my father and I used to take drives together in New York City. We'd drive around Central Park at a very formative age for me, and he'd tell me stories. And I was just trying to recreate how wondrous it was to hear about your dad's life, right? But then, this story about his first love, it had to do with him being in the Navy in Korea, and him being a naval photographer, and when I think about it ends with a terrible event that gets him very injured to a certain part of his body, and when I think about the amount of research I did on naval slang, the actual, even though I took photography in high school, the actual process of developing, photographs, and then how that gets churned into something, that sausage becomes something that gives you the freedom to invent. The idea of craft is something teachable, just goes out the window, because it's such, by the time you make that sausage, you've done so many things just to, again, create, I think, a space for yourself where you can invent, because unquestionably you are trying to honor, like Chad was saying, you're trying to honor these people that formed you, but it is rarely interesting honoring them with what they actually said and did, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Because my favorite story about this is this. Joseph Heller's daughter once accused him of lifting verbatim dialogue from his, of what she said and putting it in his books. And Joseph Heller, this will tell you what kind of dad Joseph Heller was. Joseph Heller goes, "What makes you think you're interesting enough to be in my novel?" Which I understand. I mean, in a weird way, like making it interesting on the page is a whole different litmus test than the feeling which to you is interesting, if that makes sense. So invention springs from feeling in some ways, right? To me.
From what you say?
Invention springs from feeling, like some of these original feelings, or even some of these original events. But as we know, like you put those events down, or you try to. The most autobiographical things in my novel ended up on the cutting room floor. Yeah.
I think, for me, and I think this is just my own way of thinking about some of the very same things you guys are saying, but for me, the sort of working principle is I have to be interested in this, and I have to stay interested, by hook or by crook, I have to find what is interesting in this. My pet theory about the person that's telling you for the third time about their great-grandfather who did X, Y, and Z is that they're secretly bored. and they're, or maybe not so secretly bored. And here comes this story again about their grandfather again. Because they're just on autopilot, spiritually speaking, I mean, you just want to interrupt them and say, "But what are you really thinking about anything?" And I think as writers, sure, we're susceptible to that too. I mean, you maybe you have this scene that you've just been thinking about, like, ooh, now it's time for me to trot out that scene that I could have written weeks ago, but I've been holding on to it because now's the time for it. And you put it down, and for me, invariably, I'm bored. And I have to find a way to complicate it somehow, whether that's, pull a gun or something, I don't know. Somebody's got to do something, or just tell a joke or describe the trees or whatever it is. But somehow I have to stay hyper vigilant about staying interested. And I have to trust that at some level, what interests me at that level will interest some other human being. And maybe not everyone, almost certainly not every other human being, but just a handful, like 5,000.
No, that speaks to a quote by Robert Frost that has always stuck with me. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. I think, we're talking a lot about like these early drafts, and how do you find something interesting there? Sometimes it's not the guy who's, your dad who's telling you the story again. It's your portrayal of that is interesting. But also, there's always the element of you want to end up in a different place than you thought. You want to end up somewhere new.
I do. I will say, like, I like to start with sort of like omega moments on a chapter to chapter basis. Like there's a crank call scene in my novel, which was really fun to write because Lord knows, like the crank call has died with the cell phone. You know what I mean? What I knew was that because someone told me a story. This must have been 15 years ago. Someone told me this story about making crank calls as a kid. And they make a crank call to a payphone in New York, and the guy answers the phone and says, "Meet me in Central Park and I'll tell you the meaning of life." And I was like, oh my God. I was like, that's just rich with possibility. And so, so for me, sometimes it's like the question is, how do I get to that point? And then to take Patrick's point about character, then you have characters with their own, like, divining and defining logic, and you put them in that, you aim them toward that omega point, you aim them toward that lodestar, and stuff starts to happen, and that equals plot, right? And so that equals
That's
plot.
it. Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I'm going to write that down. Yeah, anything any of y'all say about plot, I'm going to write that down.
I always come up with this stuff on coffee in front of an audience, and later I forget it. It's just like,
That's what the taping is.
so, okay, good.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Save us, Henry.
What's up?
Save us.
Okay. Stop talking. Yeah. Well, something else that struck me actually about each one of your novels. I mean, we've got some very different novels up here. You know, you can answer either one of these questions because I think we're getting toward the end here. But either I mean, this is a bit of a boring question, but I mean specifically with regard to, you know, what you were trying to do in your last novel, not just in general. Who was maybe a writer you looked to kind of guide you through, and or a completely different question, how does you know your setting influence your book? Because I think the setting is how, you know, home is associated with family, and so you've got physical roots that you're each kind of talking about in a way. And Adam, yours is really interesting because you're you know, going from apartment to apartment in New York, but you're still dealing with the idea of home. So two completely different questions, probably should be asked in completely different panels, but there you go.
I guess for me, the epigraph of my novel, Fulfillment, comes from True West by Sam Shepard, which is about two brothers, and my book is about two brothers. And that play was probably, I mean, it's so funny and so dark and so like mythic in some ways. And so I think I was thinking a lot about that, and maybe Shepard's work in general. I mean, he's always writing about families and family conflict. And I was interested in kind of how two people can come from the same family and just take wildly different paths in life, which is really true within my own family. And in Kentucky, I have cousins who, I mean, I often wonder, like, how did I'm maybe I think I'm the only grandchild out of 18 grandchildren that went to college, and the other cousins, had different levels of success, but some just went completely into like opioids or whatever. It's like, how does that happen when we all pretty much came from the same home, the same place, And I think there's something of that in True West, right? Because you have the one brother who's a screenwriter and the other brother who is a criminal, right? And they're coming from they've ended up in very different class situations as adults, and so there's that tension there, and that's, I think, often what Shepard was writing about, sort of, maybe it came from guilt of him having this success in Hollywood or as a screen or a playwright, or I don't know, but there's this sense of like where you came from and how you got there, and then this guilt, or like how things could have gone differently, a counterfactual, I guess. So yeah.
Author-wise, an author who's had a really big influence on me is Elizabeth Strout, and it's because of what she's, in a seemingly relaxed way, what she's done with very ordinary characters, characters who don't have big dynamic dramatic things going on in their lives necessarily, but she finds the drama, and that's just, she's just mining those characters so effectively. And her last book, if you haven't read it, Tell Me Everything, is a novel that brings all of those characters she's been writing about together into one book. And I sound like her publicist, but her new book, I know, that's coming out next year, actually steps into a new world of characters. So if you're an Elizabeth Strout fan, we have that to look forward to. I chose Ohio. I grew up in Florida, and my father grew up in a tiny town in Ohio. So that's where my grandparents lived their entire lives. And this sort of goes back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. I found out the whole reason that I wrote Buckeye was because I found out about something that really interested me that then ended up not being the topic of the book, but it was the diving board point. And that was that my father's grandmother, who was a really cranky, pious, judgmental person living in this tiny little town, that she died in the middle of an argument that she started herself. She died in the saddle. She died like boots on. She was just not a happy person. But I found out that she had had an affair for decades with somebody down the street he had his own family, and they had maintained this affair. And I found it out after everybody was dead except the person who told me, and then that person died. So it left me all this creative room to wonder. And I just started thinking, and it goes back to what you were saying. So what did this do to the dynamics that none of us could know? You know what? I know what it was like growing up with those people, and it was usually not pleasant. I'm not talking about my parents, but my grandparents, that generation. That was not a happy household. But we were all missing a key piece of information. And so it was. There's an affair in the book that lasts about 3 weeks, and that's it, because it's all about afterwards. So it's not about a lifelong affair. But I just started thinking, what are the lies something like that must generate on a daily basis that you'll be telling to everybody else, the people you love the most, and the lies you would tell yourself? And if you tell those over decades, don't they start to feel like truths? So that was where that was my starting point.
I'll just say that does. I love that story because that points out how in relationships there is a born-on date of secrets, and you only get a certain window to tell those secrets. And man, if you don't get that secret out, it becomes nuclear. But I can say that for me, I'm writing about New York City, 1980 to 1981. Sometimes I think about my novel as like a historical novel because I'm writing about a city that no longer exists. I'm also writing about a way of life that no longer exists. And I'm certainly writing about a feral kind of childhood that no longer exists. I mean, I like to say that the reason Gen X is so intent upon surveilling its children is because, it's directly proportional to the number of times we nearly died because our parents didn't know what we were doing. That's neither here nor there. I didn't have a model for my book, which is probably why it took so long. But I will say this. I wanted to have the same energy in describing New York as Saul Bellow described Chicago in The Adventures of Augie March. And that is to say that when my editor and I named this theme, which was, we called it the New York Sublime. And so there were just times where you were trying to not evoke postcard New York, but New York in that particular era, that particularly grimy, dangerous, but highly experienced era when you were a kid and you had the freedom to move through a city on a bike without a helmet and in such a way that you relished and reveled that freedom. And so then it's like, I don't know, tracking shot in Goodfellas, man, like entering the Copacabana, like just like energy, and bringing all of my addiction to bear on those settings.
In terms of structural models, I probably learned a hard lesson in that my structural model, to the extent I have one, of my novel was a short story. I'm not sure that was the best choice, but it was Cheever's The Swimmer, which, again, like we've said about other things, if you're not familiar with it, please treat yourself. It's a fantastic story from the 50s. It's just brilliant. And I don't want to give anything really away except that the passage of time is treated in a particular way in this story. And I wanted to do something similar in Shield the Joyous. The action of the entire book takes place in just one afternoon, and yet entire seasons will pass in the course of one afternoon. And which might mean I just spoiled the Cheever story. I don't know, but hopefully not. So that was always a sort of loose guiding structural principle to the extent I have one. And As for ideas of home, I mean, I was, of course, very conscious of, in some way, writing about home, which for this book was, again, this very sort of particular geography and neighborhood, very like the rural neighborhood I grew up in Yazoo City in the 1980s. So that was home. But, you know, I worked on this book 19 years, and I think, yeah, all of those were spent living in Los Angeles. So there was a kind of distance, geographical and distance in time from the home I was writing about that really energized me. There was a lot of juice in that for me. And I'll just mention this one moment. At some point, Google Street View was invented in the course of my writing this book, and it occurred to me once that I could actually go stand at the foot of my driveway that I grew up in, and I would not do it. I was physically afraid to go on there and stand at the foot of my driveway and look up at my house that I grew up in and hadn't been in eons. I still haven't done it. And I didn't want to do it because I had it where I wanted it and where I needed it to write about it, and I needed it to stay like that, at least until I got this thing finished. But yeah, so that's kind of what home was for me, and there was a lot of, as I say, there's a lot of energy in that kind of thing.
That is actually really interesting that everybody on this panel, the four of you, are living now in a place that you did not grow up. And I wonder if that assisted at all, but I don't think we have time for that. Okay, yeah, let's do some questions now. Just the loudest question will get answered. Just kidding. Yeah.
Question for Patrick, I think it applies to everybody. I saw an interview that you described what you read when you were 16. Phenomenal. And so my question is, you have your real life family experience, but you're also, anyone who reads as much as you did when you were 16, you also have these literary families. So how did these literary families inform how you thought about your own family? Like Pet Sematary, I think is one of them that you read. I mean, it's a family novel.
I love that. How did Pet Sematary influence my own family?
All the reading you did.
Yeah.
Some kind of impact on how you thought about your own existence.
Absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you. And I would say in advance of what I'm about to say that watching the Brady Bunch had the same effect as of what I'm about to say from what I read, because anytime, or the Partridge Family, or the Waltons, my God, the Waltons. I became a writer because of John Boy Walton. I swear to God I did. But I would look at these, and I was just constantly, the television's here, and I was constantly going, get a little closer. My mom kept going, back up, you're going to ruin your eyes. Oh, no. I need blinders. The summer I was 16, I read wide, and I love thinking back on this because no one was guiding me. And so I was just going, I would walk into the bookstore with my allowance, and I would walk out with a book. I don't know why. I couldn't get to the library. That's why I wasn't using the library. And I would read. If I happened to get to the classic section, I might walk out with To Kill a Mockingbird or something older. I might walk out with the novelization of The Cannonball Run or The Cannonball Run 2. I recommend that one. That's talk about a lot of dialogue, a lot of characters. The John Jakes books, if anybody has read those, the Kent Family Chronicles, that summer I read all 8, and they're all about 600 or 700 pages long. And that follows one family, and it's this really corny, very user-friendly pastiche of American history where the family just happens to encounter famous people. And basically every family I read about that wasn't mine was, because no family was like my own family, but it was hugely influential. I will say, just to add, I'm sorry this is a little long, I think I came around to trying to actively not write about people like that, like the people I came from, to now realizing that is what I know and that is what I can write well about, is the people that I was familiar with. And I don't have to write about their lives, but I know them. So I am drawn back to them. But yeah, every family I looked at in books and television when I was growing up was, it was just a fantasy land.
Other questions?
Adam was talking about how protean the first draft is, and I was wondering if any of the four of you, if a previous iteration of the novel was like radically different and a different POV or something, and why you decided to change it.
I can tell a really good story about that. So after my first two books came out, I was like, well, now it's time to sit down and write the great American novel, and I wrote 70 pages of a book about my novel's main character at the age of 33, and his life's falling apart in Nashville, and I sold that as a partial to Knopf. It was originally a 3-act book. Part 1 was called Gun. Act 1 was called Gun. Act 2 was called Playworld. And Act 3 was called The Two Towers. And when I started to write Act 2, the novel completely ground to a halt, to the point where I thought I was going to have to abandon the novel. And so I went to talk to someone about it, because I was in despair, and I bought groceries with the advance money, and I was going to have to give back some of that money, less groceries. And they said, "Well, tell me about it." And I was like, "Well, it's about this kid who had, was on set and these TV shows. He was the only kid on set. It's about crazy relationships I had with an older woman and an abusive wrestling coach." And I was like, "But none of it seemed strange at the time." And the person was like, "Well, that's a really good line." And I went home and was like, I wrote the first line of the book, which is, in the fall of 1980, when I was 14, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, a mother of 2, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. And the point is that that reshuffled everything. Like suddenly the 70 pages, good pages, were just umbilicus. And that's the thing that's so fascinating, and that you've got to trust, which is that you're not writing the beginning. You're possibly writing toward the beginning. And hovering in that space, and this goes to everything I think that's been said in different ways in this whole panel, hovering in that space is how you sort of build an entire novel. And then I think certain through lines present themselves to you, and you see clearly what that is. And then, I could talk about this forever, but I think that, again, scene to scene, you have to hover in that space. Chapter to chapter, you have to hover in that space. And then redrafting, you then have much more clarity about what through line is. So there's a lot of faith required.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Mine is more of a comment and a question. I'm a bookseller. So would you like to know how your covers are received?
Yeah.
Later.
Many college students love it.
Oh, cool.
Patrick, everybody loves it, but women in classic book clubs love yours. Adam, yours completely causes angst. But they go to it first. And Chad, yours is the one that I look at most because it has a white cover.
I wish I could take responsibility for that. But, wow.
I love that.
That's like the rock, paper, scissors of covers.
I know. So who just, yeah. Well, thank you.
Facing you all out just makes a big difference, so.
Rock, paper, white cover.
Right.
Well, thanks y'all for coming.
Thank you.